How would I know that Venky and Eric, if I hand them both the same orange and I ask what they're smelling, they both say orange, how do I know they're perceiving the same thing? And obviously I can't. Like that's an ancient philosophical question. There's no way to know that the orange that Venky reports is the same as the orange that Eric's reporting. But what I can do is hand them an orange, a lemon, and a pizza, and ask each of them, which things, lemon or pizza, are more similar to orange. And I can do that over and over and over again. And if you do that, you can almost imagine building a map for smell, where smells that are related to each other are kind of close to each other, because everyone says that lemon is similar to orange, but different from pizza. And you can basically build a kind of map of the olfactory world through that kind of technique.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, the first of 2022, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Executive Director, and today we are delving into one of the most underrated senses, one that we often take for granted till it disappears. I speak, of course, of smell. Just imagine not having that distinctive aroma of coffee, the coffee we love, which is actually made up of 800 separate volatile chemicals. The lavender fields of our childhood, even the powerful smell of a mother to her baby, which has a stronger draw than touch. In some intricate and mysterious way, scent, emotion, and memory intertwine in the brain to create a fundamental sensorial map of the world. Yet, given that olfaction is the primary sense used by most animals to communicate with their environment and make sense of the world, by driving complex solitary and social behaviors and helping them learn, we still don't know a lot about it. Well, maybe all this is about to change for the good. Since the pandemic, research has intensified due to the very large number of people, estimated to be around 5% of the population, who've lost their sense of smell. Luckily, this condition, anosmia, is usually temporary, but it's still debilitating in that it affects taste and apparently our largest sense of emotional well-being. To help us unlock some of the mysteries of our olfactory system, we have three experts in the field today, all connected with Harvard. Bob Datta is Professor of Neurobiology at Harvard Medical School. Venkatesh Murty is Professor of Molecular and Cellular Biology at Harvard Center for Brain Science. And Dr. Eric Holbrook is an adjunct professor at Harvard and director of Rhinology at Mass Eye and Ear. So welcome to you all. Long titles, big names. Thanks for making the time to join us. Well, big Pandora's box of questions for everybody today. So let's start with you, Bob. We know that smell is the oldest of the senses, and it is intimately connected to parts of the brain that govern fundamental functions like memory and fear processing. Yet vision, sound, and touch all seem to get the attention. So why is it that in terms of neuroscience history, smell seems to be so late to the game?
So first of all, thanks, Mary, so much for having me. It's fun to join you and Venky and Eric. I think the reason why neuroscientists haven't paid as much attention to smell as perhaps we as scientists and doctors would like is because neuroscientists are humans, and humans really think of themselves as visual creatures. So, when we interact with the world, the primary way in which we do so, at least from our own self-perspective, is through our eyes, right? We gaze upon the world, we map out space, and we interact, with objects and people through sight. If you think about, how deeply our current lives have been shaped by, visuals that we're getting off the internet, right? It's obvious that vision has a kind of deep meaning and resonance for us. And if you look in the brain, about a third of the human brain is devoted to vision. So when neuroscientists in the 50s began inventing neuroscience, inventing the process through which we peer into the brain and ask how it works, the very first questions they asked really were centered around, how does the brain allow us to see? And as a consequence of, I think, those very early decisions and that very human perspective on what was important, most of modern neuroscience finds its roots in an understanding of vision. And our understanding of other senses has really lagged. Obviously, we're also creatures that communicate communicate verbally. It's part of what makes us human as well. And so we know quite a bit about hearing, right? And how we detect and organize information about sounds. But smell has been neglected despite the fact that it's both important and mysterious. And I think now that we know a little bit about vision, and now that we have better tools for understanding how the brain works, I think smell is beginning to undergo a kind of renaissance, and neuroscientists are really beginning to pay attention to how we can inhale an odor, and that odor is capable of generating incredibly evocative percepts.
Okay, so over to you, Venki. Welcome. You mentioned that it's easier to replicate images and sounds for research purposes. So why is it so difficult to do it with smell? Is it something to do with smell being grounded in individual perception? So, we can't even agree on what a good and a bad smell is. You actually talked yesterday about going back to India after many years away and suddenly visiting all these exotic smells, which you were familiar with, but you said some people would find pretty unpleasant or just not familiar.
Yeah, thanks again, Bob. I mean, thanks for it's really fun to think about this sense. So to go back to maybe your first question, so why is it difficult to replicate? I think to bounce off of something Bob mentioned briefly, we're all looking at the screen now and listening to the speakers of a computer, right? It's so facile. I mean, every smartphone has one of the most sophisticated, the light detectors, camera, and the light producers, the screen, right? Same thing with sound, microphone and speakers. So think of what is a microphone and what is a speaker for smells. And I think the thing is that you have to actually produce the actual physical object, the chemicals, in order for you to then be able to smell. So if you think there is a few dozen odors among the 800 that you mentioned in a coffee that gives you the perception of coffee, you have to reproduce all whatever 30 or more of them for you to get that in coffee, or at least some number. It's very, very hard now. So you have thousands of chemicals. If you really have to store all of those in some little device and spritz it out, it's just hard. Similarly, detecting, if I have thousands of chemicals, our noses are spectacularly quick, reversible, and complex sensitive devices. And we just don't have chemical detectors that are nearly as sophisticated in terms of the speed, reversibility, and the versatility. So I think it's just a detection and production problem. And I don't know the answer, how we're going to get around, but I hope that we start thinking more about the engineering of those devices. The second point, which is that even if we were to do that, meaning have devices that can produce smells and record smells, there's still this suspicion that we don't know how to give that specific smell of a rose that is a rose in some objective way for everybody. So this is where the subjectivity comes in. And I think there's probably parts that are universal or nearly universal. And, we don't know yet, but one hopes there is. But even if we were to produce something, we don't know exactly, what exactly do I give so that everybody smells a beautiful rose? And I think that comes to the subjective part. And I think, going back to what you said about India, it's more that it just occurred to me, as long as I grew up in India, those smells were completely internalized, were in the background. But when I moved away and when you're in a completely different environment for some period, you've sort of forgotten or dishabituated, right, to those things. When you go back, it's familiar, but yet you're smelling it in some sense for the first time. And so I think maybe that's the point you're making.
Yeah, and also things that you actually like and dislike. I mean, because there are so many complex layers to any given environment that you're in, it's very hard to say this is the smell of a classroom, say, even though that's a multi-million-dollar industry now, apparently, this scent industry, and creating the feeling, the good feeling when you walk into a hotel and replicating that smell over and over. is now a huge industry, as you know in your talk that you did. So I wanted to invite the audience at this point to send us in the Q&A what their favorite and most repulsive smells are, because I actually like the smell of skunk. And I know I'm in a minority here. I don't mean on me, but around. I love the smell when the skunk has been near a car or on the street. I like that musky smell. I think it's very earthy. Maybe I'm part badger, I don't know. But anyway, I was wondering how that equated with what other people think about the topic. Somebody's written in here, and I'm not sure what it means. Durian is a classic example, loved and hated. Durian?
Yeah, it's a kind of fruit that I think, I'm sure Bob is familiar with. So I think I grew up, we call it jackfruit in India. And I think people, people, either like it or just hate it.
Yeah.
Balsam fir. I think she means fir, the tree. Petrol smells my biggest nightmare. Interesting. So let's now, just for a minute, because we're going to talk to Dr. Holbrook about the problem with losing your sense of smell. Somebody says they love the smell of wood burning. So spoiled cantaloupe, very bad. I mean, it's just going to go on for the whole program. So in this particular group of people, it strikes me that three of us have lost our sense of smell. The actual sound producer that's working on the program was discussing that he's lost it. I lost it for 6 months, which is how I met Dr. Holbrook. And then you also lost it, didn't you, Bob?
Yeah, I lost it when I was in my 20s.
So before we talk about how it comes back and whether it comes back completely the same as it was before, I first met Dr. Holbrook, Eric Holbrook at Mass Eye and Ear. And when I went in there, they gave me this book with about 40 pages to scratch and sniff different smells, which was a really bizarre experience. And a lot of them smelled like chemicals to me. The bubble gum, there was a synthetic kind of strawberry. And you were meant to, again, I think a lot of people now think that's strawberry. They get a McDonald's strawberry shake and they think that that's strawberry. Anyway, about half of the tests I got wrong. And then the therapy, I think, was to go away and you had to sniff essential oils, 4 particular essential oils or 5, 2 or 3 times a day for the next few months to kind of retrain your brain to identify the scents with the right word. I think that's right. So, Dr. Holbrook, you must be deluged with people now coming in your office, including kids, with this lack of smell. So are you still passing around the essential oils?
Yeah, yep. I am.
Yes.
It's it's unfortunately beyond causes that are related to like sinus infections and chronic sinus disease and polyps. There's not a lot out there in terms of medical therapy. And the olfactory training, what you're describing, smelling these 4 odors twice a day, every day, is something that has been looked at by multiple different clinicians and scientists, and found that by testing, at least, there is an improvement in groups that are doing this, groups of patients that are doing it versus those that aren't doing the training. It's hard to control for this type of study, obviously, and to really know how much of a benefit it's giving, it's difficult to know, because one of the good things about the olfactory system is that outside of, as compared to vision or hearing, it is able to repair itself. The olfactory neurons are able to grow back again. The cells of the epithelium are able to divide, make new neurons. And so it is, somewhat improved in that point compared to some of the other senses. So when you're comparing like whether or not something's working in terms of a therapy, you also have to take into account that there is spontaneous recovery that can occur.
And Bob, did your sense of smell return exactly as before, or was it in any way altered?
Yes, no, it was quite altered when it was altered. I had some chemotherapy when I was in my 20s, and I lost my sense of smell and taste for 6 weeks, 2 months. But then it came back just fine. But I remember what it was like when it was gone. It was really jarring and disorienting, and food tasted terrible, and it was really disconcerting. So I very much understand how people are feeling off, when they lose their sense of smell as a consequence of COVID.
Yeah, when I was reading up a little bit, I had no idea that how important it was in terms of how primal it was in the brain, and that it can kind of create all these pathways to other things. So the thing that strikes me is, for example, treacle pudding. I first had that at school, and it was a squidgy, heavy, ugly lump of this suet, which had a terrible smell to it, which made me want to throw up before I even tasted it. And so there was this visceral, textural, visual, and smell, this repulsive smell, all tied into that one experience. And I just wondered, I've never eaten it since. I have been able to rediscover foods that I didn't like as a child, but I wonder if you can reprogram that whole series of things that happened from that one lump of pudding. Does anyone relate to that at all? Biologically, does it make sense?
Yeah, one thing that's interesting about the olfactory system, I think, Eric, I'm sure you've seen this clinically, and Venki and I see it in the science, is how plastic and changeable the parts of your brain are that are associated with smell. Smell clearly kind of has these two, like as Venki was describing, these kind of two components. On the one hand, it's probably true that smells all have a kind of common character, right? Citrus fruits probably smell like citrus to all of us. But at the same time, they're deeply personal and experience dependent. Our own personal, as you were just describing, your own personal experience with the suet, really turns you off. Whereas I might find that to be delicious potentially, right? But it's exactly this plasticity, this ability of your brain to individualize your experience with, particular smells that also kind of gives you the tools to change your perception over time, right? And we all know this to be true. When you were a kid, right, you hated coffee. I certainly did, right? I hated beer or coffee. There's lots of such smells and tastes that were just horrible. And in the morning now I can't live without two full cups. And in the evening, it's nice to have a little bit of scotch to end the day, right? And that's very different from the way I used to perceive those smells and tastes. And so experience plays a predominant role, which is certainly intuitive, and at least a little bit rationalizes why smell training might work. It's clear that your brain is constantly kind of rewiring itself to remind itself of what it likes in terms of smells and what it doesn't like, and it's rewiring itself, continuously in the nose and in the brain to help you understand what smells are, and that very process can help you change your perspective on smells, over time.
So I was wondering, Mary, so there's several questions, people talking about taste versus smell, and I think Eric obviously can give a great clinical answers, but I think it might be worth just taking 20 seconds to clarify. So I think when people say taste, most often what they mean is flavor, which is a combination of the taste and the smell. So when you chew food, the molecules, basically some of the aroma goes up through the back of the roof of your palate to the olfactory system, and you're actually smelling your food sort of backwards. It's called retronasal olfaction. So when you're chewing food and volatilizing it, that's really flavor. That's a combination of smell and taste. So which is why if you lose just the sense of smell, but the taste is mostly okay, you still find it awful because your flavor, your basic tastes are there, the sweet, bitter, whatever, 5 or 6. But that's very important to understand that what people commonly think of taste is most likely kind of flavor. This is smell and taste. So some of the people who are mentioning that they lost smell but not quite taste, I'm curious to hear how this is in Eric's opinion now with the COVID, when people come in now, taste versus smell.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of studies, good and bad, that have been done since this pandemic started, and the recognition of problems with loss of smell. And that question always comes up because one of the first things that a lot of people recognize is the lack of ability to appreciate flavor of food, right? So then you have to sort it out, because when they do actual testing of taste and smell, there are a small percent of people from the pandemic, from COVID-19, that actually have some diminished ability to taste sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, which is a fifth taste. In addition to that, and Venk, you probably have interest in this also, is the possible effect on the trigeminal system. So another nerve in your nose and in your mouth can detect chemicals, but it's more of the heat, the spiciness, so to speak. But when we talk about that, we have to be very specific about, like, capsaicin, for instance, that gives you the hotness to hot buffalo wings or something like that, or chili powder. But that also contributes quite a bit to flavor of food and your whole experience eating. So a lot of my time when I evaluate patients is really getting down to the basics of what is really bothering them and teasing it out and asking them, okay, for taste, can you tell if something is salty? When you eat potato chips or pretzels, can you tell there's salt on it? Things like that. And so it's an important factor, because you really want to tell if you want to know what part of the system is actually causing the problem. With COVID-19, it's the vast majority of it is sense of smell. But I wanted to get to Bob's point about the plasticity of olfaction, which I think is also an important part of why we use olfactory training, because it can be changed to some degree, and that's been recognized in the past years ago in people who have specific congenital or specific loss of smell for certain odors. And some of the scientists that were working on this actually found that if you practice smelling that odor, you can get some of it back again. And it's not well known why that reason is. Some people feel it might be similar to master wine tasters, for instance, that can really hone in their ability to smell and detect certain chemicals in what they're tasting and smelling, or what they're drinking, and look for impurities. And they practice on these battery of odors to really be able to hone in on those senses. So it may be something more higher up central in the brain, but some of the studies that I have been doing or did in the past, looking at mice, for instance, and how the specific nerves that have their own specific ability to detect certain odors, after exposing them, after damaging the nerves over and over, there is a difference in the amount of those nerves that come up when the cells divide to make new neurons. And in some cases, it almost looked like they were making better targets back to the brain. So there might be a specific cellular reason for it, but also a higher order kind of reprocessing or honing in of the brain on certain signals that might be working. So overall, the system is, I agree, very plastic, and maybe we can alter it to certain degrees.
We've got tons of comments coming in now, so some of them are really interesting. Someone said, Everett Briggs said, no loss of smell, but following a head injury in 2001, my sense of smell and taste became very amplified and has remained so. I can smell cigarettes at 100 yards. India, always an amazing sensory experience on subsequent visits, has become an olfactory assault. If smell is affected by a brain injury, isn't it usually lost? Do you know the answer to that, anybody? Eric?
Well, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to be a loss. That's the most common complaint is, when people come to see clinicians for smell problems, it's typically a diminished sense of smell. But there is, let's say, a good example are people with migraines, for instance. Some of them are specifically sensitive to smells that can trigger their migraines. And that, again, might be a more higher processing type of issue that triggers the migraine and makes them more sensitive. So it could be that. In addition, in COVID-19 is a good example of this. When people are recovering from their smell loss months after the initial infection, they can get a distortion in their sense of smell when they're smelling things called parosmia. And, that's aversive also. People don't like what they're smelling and try to get away from it. So there's many reasons why, the head injury could have had this effect. But overall, yes, and it's typically a diminished sense of smell or loss of sense of smell that occurs.
Somebody else here, Barbara Sweet, has said when she was in her 70s, her sense of smell expanded. I'm able to smell scents as far away as 1,000 feet. Wow. Adele says, I lost smell, but seem to be able to taste okay. Can smell recover after 5 years? Is that unlikely? The longer it remains absent for it to resurrect?
Clinically, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not impossible, but it's we usually use on the order of like a year to kind of figure out whether or not the prognosis is better or worse for somebody. If it's a complete loss and they don't have any evidence of ability to detect odors or have these other signs like parosmia, then there's less of a signal that the system is regenerating and returning to function again. But not out of the realm of possibilities. And I would advise anybody who has a smell loss that is persisting to see a clinician, an ENT usually, just to make sure that there's nothing present in the nose or, a reason that can be solved or, at least look into further.
Okay, someone over here points up a very good thing, I think. Bob, when you said it smells like citrus, what did you mean? I think this is a really good point, because we all know that a lemon is a different smell than an orange.
Yep.
But here we see the deficiency of language in being able to explain the difference.
That's right. I think this is a really key question. Like, how do we know that? How would I know that Venki and Eric, if I hand them both the same orange and I ask them what they're smelling, they both say orange. How do I know they're perceiving the same thing? And obviously, I can't. Like, that's an ancient philosophical question. There's no way to know that the orange that Venki reports is the same as the orange that Eric's reporting. But what I can do is hand them an orange, a lemon, and a pizza, and ask each of them, which things, lemon or pizza, are more similar to orange. And I can do that over and over and over again. And if you do that, you can almost imagine building a map for smell, where smells that are related to each other are kind of close to each other, because everyone says that lemon is similar to orange but different from pizza. And you can basically build a kind of map of the olfactory world through that kind of technique. And that kind of relational map, which is what we as scientists call it, that kind of map is probably common amongst people, which is why all of us on this call probably think that lemon is more similar in terms of its quality to an orange than pizza. And so that shared kind of commonality and similarity amongst certain kinds of chemicals is what I mean when I say all of us agree that an orange is an orange. That's actually what I mean. I mean, we think that these relationships are common amongst us, but there's lots of room for variation. I think lots of people would think that there are many, many smells that some people will think are similar and other people will think are different. And that variation probably derives from our individual experience.
I've often thought that about other senses too, I must say. Not just smell. I've often thought when I'm talking about blue and
Right.
you're talking about blue, are we talking about the same thing? How do we know?
Hard to know. Impossible to know. Right?
Okay, Venki, in your research, you look at environments with different layers of smell and you experiment with mice. This is a simplistic rendition of what you do. Mice following scent trails is quite important. So I imagine when we were living in caves, it was a lot simpler because we were using our noses to locate food, to follow predators, and to find suitable mates. So is it no longer the case? And is that why smell is partly less important? Because we have all this background tract of smell in our lives that overwhelms those initial kind of markers that we would have picked up on.
Yeah, it's the one thing I would say is that it's probably long before, I guess, humans, in some sense, primates and before, I think already weren't necessarily doing a lot of navigation, following things based on smell. So it is true that I think somebody in the chat and the Q&A had also pointed out that, dogs, lots of people have dogs. I mean, they're obviously spectacular at tracking, whether it's airborne or surface on the ground. So I don't know if the loss of the navigation capability was some sort of a triggering event for us kind of not being as good. I think long before that, if you look at many animals, you get the feeling that smell, first of all, tells you something is there in that area, right? Once you know that, then you might use vision and audition and whatever else to kind of navigate. It's like, oh, it's worth now searching because I can smell the thing that I really care about, right? So I think I'm not 100% sure that all animals are particularly great at using odors themselves in the absence of sight and sound to navigate, although some animals like dogs can certainly do that. So in some sense, maybe there's two different questions. One, do you actually use the smell alone to navigate? Can you kind of, follow the scent path, scent trail to go, versus scent is one of the cues that in the environment tells you, aha, something important is there, and therefore this region is worth foraging or searching for. I don't know. I think, maybe Bob and Eric can chime in. There are ideas that once vision became a pretty big deal for certain mammals, especially color vision, I would say, that maybe animals were less reliant on smell in proportion to the vision. That's why a lot of our brain is sight and sound, and proportionately the olfactory part is much, much less. So that seems, it's a good correlation. Whether or not it's a causal thing, it's unclear. So yes, we have lost it probably long before caves.
Do you guys want to chime in on that, or do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there is, as Venki was mentioning, there's this idea that, we are really visual creatures, but it's important to remember that many creatures are largely olfactory, right? And if you look at their brains, if you look at the brain of a mouse, a third of its brain is devoted to olfaction, right? In the same way that a third of our brain is devoted to vision. And there is this theory that Venki was mentioning, that when old world monkeys acquired trichromatic vision, saw in like full Technicolor, right? That was when smell became less important, and when that lineage truly became visual. And that coincided, the details aren't quite right, but that coincided with the loss of machinery that some animals have for smelling pheromones. So actually mice have two separate organs in their nose. And we still don't quite understand the distinctions between these two separate organs, but one seems particularly important for detecting pheromones, or odors that are used for social communication between individuals. And the other seems like on the surface it's more important for kind of just generally detecting odors. And that special pheromone sensor that mice have, we don't have in our noses. And it's thought that was lost, in the old world monkeys and in related, when we acquired the ability to see in three colors. Again, like the science is not quite solid there, but it's an interesting theory. And Eric, I actually wonder what you think. You see humans all the time. Do you think they're human pheromones? What do you think? It's still a question to debate. So I'm wondering what Eric thinks.
You kind of want to believe that you can, but my answer is no. I think a lot of it is from my training, maybe, but there's no nerve. There is something called Jacobson's pit or Jacobson's organ, which is the vestigial kind of vomal nasal organ that mice and lower mammals have. You can find that in a human, this little pit area, but there's no nerve that connects it to the brain, like in lower mammals. But odors can do, there are communications, right? Odors can communicate still between people without necessarily like having the experience of smelling, I guess. And a good example of that is there's been studies where females can cycle together, menstruate at the same time if they live together. And so there's some kind of communication through what they think is odors. Now, I don't know if that's been completely proven or not, but that's just one example of how that can happen. It doesn't mean it has to use the same system, but there's still some type of communication. So there's almost a two-sidedness to the olfactory field about pheromones. There's like people who believe in them and people who don't believe in them.
Well, this is an interesting example, right, of androstenone and its receptor. So women have this polymorphism in the receptor for this smell called androstenone, meaning that the gene for the receptor that detects this smell, androstenone, is different depending in individual women. And this is a smell that is commonly found in humans in male armpits, right? It's like male armpit smell. And 2/3 of women, depending on the gene, the specifics of the gene they have, find it really gross. And I think 1/3 find it attractive. Right? if I recall correctly.
It's like skunk.
I mean, but this
is
relates
going to be the
the
new marketing ploy for me. Yeah.
larger. I think several people are asking questions about the individual variability. So there's individual variability, of course, in sort of the higher cognitive, the brain that we were talking about. But I think to expand on what Bob said, the actual sequence of the receptors for all of us are actually different. So we have around 350 or so, different types of olfactory receptors, but the actual gene sequence for all of them are all a little bit different for each of us. So it's very possible at the very front end, the nose itself has, differences in the way we detect the same palette of chemicals.
So you're talking about something very important here, because maybe what you alluded to, Eric, with the pheromones is we've suppressed all that stuff because we cover ourselves with perfume and antiperspirant, God knows what else, body lotions. So in a way, we've kind of trained our noses to like these kind of synthetic smells. And Urs has written in and says, talk about smell in human relationships. Is there a role for synthetic smells in human relationships? So that's a very interesting point, because as you know, Venki, you did this whole thing with Dawn Goldworm, who's a multi-million-dollar branding expert, whose nose is used for top-end scents, and she does the locker room thing for Nike and all these other, she creates these brand smells. So clearly, for something that's not being given a lot of attention in terms of the senses, it's a huge moneymaker. I mean, we all know about sommeliers and parfumers getting that their nose is their big thing. So maybe because Bob told me that cancer cells have a distinctive smell, which I was amazed at, which must tell something. The body is trying to tell you something if something's not right. Surely it lines up. It makes sense that all these other things matter too. I mean, if you smell something, an armpit or whatever it might be, that gels with you, it must have a chemical effect. It must. If smells give us a sense of well-being, which is what this whole industry is predicated upon, that it must also have a kind of attraction aspect. There must be an attraction thing going on, even if it's in a bottle. So I don't know if I'm asking a question now. I'm just making an observation.
Well, it's the one thing there's the people who study human reactions to smells. They're called psychophysicists. The one thing they've noticed is that if you give a human a smell and you ask them just to freeform respond, what do you think? The first thing they don't do is identify it. The first thing they do is tell you whether they think it's good or bad. Like that's the initial response. And typically, if you ask people about odors, they kind of have very strong opinions about what's good or what's bad. As scientists, we think of this as a kind of axis that all smells lie upon. And it could be that actually the very first thing your brain tries to do when it smells something is decide whether it thinks it's good or bad. It's very crude, kind of along a single line kind of way before deciding the details. Like, is it an orange or a lemon comes later, and whether it's something you like or don't like comes first. Thank you. What do you think?
I think that makes sense. I would add, just to be very clear, in some sense, the debate is whether or not that good or bad thing is innate, meaning that you're just kind of born with it and you stick with it, versus experienced and depending on environment, culture. I would probably tend to lie on the latter, that like a lot of that I think, is learned implicitly or explicitly. True, we do have this reaction of, that smells good, or that's not good. But, coffee, this is one of the most amazing things, right? Coffee, I think even for non-coffee drinkers, I think coffee smells good if it's fresh kind of coffee, right? The smell of the coffee, but the actual taste of coffee is really pretty bad, right?
Yeah.
We kind of get used to it, but it's right. And like runny cheeses are the opposite, right? They taste so good in some sense, but I think people would agree they smell pretty bad. So I think, this bad and good, it's kind of,
arbitrary. It's very arbitrary.
I don't know if it's arbitrary. It's like there's probably some starting point, but then, you really have the experience and you kind of learn it. So that's the one thing I would add to Bob's point about the axis.
That's kind of the argument for the people against pheromones, is that it's a early learned behavior. Even so one of the examples of people who believe in pheromones for like raising infants is the suckling response in response to the smell of the mother. And but you can argue that that's from the initial interaction alone that causes that behavior response. And quickly the infant learns that, the smell is equating to breastfeeding, and then, the suckling response occurs. So it's a tough one to prove.
But since it triggers effects in the brain, and we know that, it's smell, there's the taste and smell of fear. Something frightful is indelibly branded into your brain if you have a frightful experience. And that is connected with smell. I have a friend who's a Marine, and he was in one of the bombings in the Middle East, and where a lot of Marines were killed. And his job was going in, picking up the body parts. And he said the most pervasive PTSD he's had from that wasn't anything he saw, it was the smell. And he still wakes up with that smell. It's more pervasive than anything else, and he can't get rid of the smell. It's in his consciousness. So, which takes me back to this whole primitive thing that we really are, we've numbed ourselves out to real sense, I think. I think the industry of Bounce and Febreze and new car smells, all this stuff has overloaded our sensory system. I don't even think we know if we've got any pheromones anymore, because they've been so degraded in terms of our own innate responses. How would we know? If you have
maybe they're creating new behavior responses in a negative way.
Yeah.
Odors.
It's a thought. It's an interesting thought, because it's a huge industry, and we can't underestimate that.
Just Mary, to relate to what you just said, and maybe a couple of questions or people are talking about smell that just brings back some very old memories. As somebody was talking about their grandmother. So I think it's important to know that, these old memories, evocative things that you get, can be both negative and positive, right? We talk about the Proust's Madeleine, bringing all the amazing things from the childhood, but you just gave an example of a smell that brings something that's quite negative.
The fear effect. But it's similarly, the good effects are there too. Lots of good questions here. Is loss of smell sometimes a predictor of Alzheimer's? Who wants to take that? Eric? Bob?
Yeah, it's pretty well known at this time that there is an association. It doesn't mean that if you have a smell loss, you're going to have Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's disease is also another one. Neurodegenerative diseases can be associated with smell loss. But it's more common that you're going to have a smell loss associated from something else.
Right.
Yeah, I just don't want the audience to think that, having a smell loss means
Somebody's asked, Sam said, I've just heard an interview with E.O. Wilson, this I was reading about last week, where he affirmed that ants have an exquisite sense of smell, but near zero sense of sight or sound. So they're totally dependent on smell.
That's true for some species. Yeah, I was actually about to type up an answer to it. So I think, yes, ants ants, first of all, they're extraordinary different species, right? There's so many different. Some ants are very, very good at sight as well. So it depends on the species of ants. But the ones that we kind of normally maybe look like carpenter ants and so on, where they're kind of wandering around following else, they do have, as obviously the master Wilson says, that a very good sense of sound, a smell. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I would say it's general. There are species of ants that are also good at sight.
Somebody has asked, could Dr. Datta repeat the name of the gene responsible for how women perceive men's smell?
It's the androstogen receptor.
We might have to type that in for them. Yeah, androstogen.
Yeah, I will type it in.
Never heard of that. Okay, someone says, I haven't had much of a sense of smell my whole life. What causes that? I do have quite a history of allergies. Are those things linked in any way?
It gets to the question of inflammation versus some other cause that had a more of a neurologic effect, a deleterious neurologic effect. The inflammatory causes can work in two ways. One is the inflammation and swelling can block the airflow from getting to the area in our nose where the sense of smell nerves are. And in many cases, if that happens, it's a fluctuating ability. So sometimes you're able to smell, and then other times you can't smell, depending on the allergy season or something like that. People with polyps can have more prolonged smell loss related to the inflammation. But it could have been something else early on. Could have been a virus, could have been head injury. There's all sorts of things that may have brought on the smell loss.
I was going to ask you something about processing information, because Bob, your work has a lot to do with how smell helps us in the world and helps us, in fact, navigate and guides our behavior. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So as we were discussing earlier, for many animals, not all animals, but for many animals, smell is really important for helping them survive, right? So in a mouse, if you genetically modify a mouse so that a mouse can't smell, those mice can't survive. They require their sense of smell for everything, for finding their mother's teeth at birth, for finding food, for finding mates, avoiding predators, finding appropriate shelters. All of those behaviors for a mouse, depend critically on the sense of smell. And so, from a scientific perspective, that makes smell very interesting, right? Because it suggests that a mouse really takes advantage of its sense of smell to guide it in the world. And so from a science perspective, what I think about and what I know Venki thinks about is, how are smells connected to behaviors, right? How does a smell prompt an action? Why, when a mouse encounters a cat, why does it run away, right? And why, when a mouse encounters peanut butter, does it tend to kind of run towards it and try to eat it? What is the diversity of behaviors that smells can elicit, both in animals and in humans? And I think, both Venki and I think that if we can understand a little bit about that relationship, about the relationship between kind of sensation and odors on the one hand, and the generation of behaviors and actions in the world on the other, we might be able to get at kind of more fundamental principles about what the brain actually does and how it works. I think a lot of our fascination with smell is because it was the first evolved sense. And so in some sense, it's a kind of scaffold maybe that we can use that's simple or simpler that might get us to better understand complicated things about the brain, like cognition. And so one of our goals, I don't want to speak for you too much, Venki, but I think one of our shared goals is to try to use our understanding of the sense of smell to better understand how the brain works. And of course, what the brain does, much of what the brain does is about generating behavior in the world.
Yeah, I think to refer from a touch base at the very beginning of this event, and Bob talked about vision and then the primacy of that. I don't know, naively, if you look at it, it feels like vision, particularly in audition too, you never kind of look at something and say, oh, that's good or bad. It almost feels like you always have to then go into the details of it. Like, there's a face, there's a house, there's a tree, there's motion, there's color. So it's almost like when you look at it, it feels like you're already analyzing it. You're not first saying good or bad. As opposed to what we're talking about in smell, somehow, at least a subjective experience is, we don't quite analyze what we smell in such analytical detail, if you will. Like we seem to somehow get some gestalt of it and just make some sense of it. I think that for Bob and I think, and I'm sure for Eric too, it fascinates us, like, is it really true, first of all? Or is it just because it's mysterious, that's what we feel? If it is true, how is it that a brain can do both, right? In one sense, you're really parsing everything in detail. And in the other case, you're kind of just getting this vague stuff and deciding, good or bad and pleasant, unpleasant, rather than really digging into the details of it. So I think it's a bit more, I don't know, philosophical almost, but I think that's what's, at the basic science level, extremely interesting.
Could that be a result of how odors, once they get out of the perception of the odor, the nerves, the connections of the nerves deeper in the brain are so dispersed? Is that a reason why? Because it just hits on everything, and it's then not centralized or compartmentalized like vision or hearing.
It's a great question. So I think in a way, there's a related thing. I think Eric, you're bringing up, like, can we learn something from the actual architecture of the wiring of the system to understand why perceptually we feel that way? And that's obviously the heart of neuroscience, right? I mean, it'd be amazing if we can, take the perceptual phenomenon, the psychological phenomenon, and have some explanation at the level of the, I think this is, for me, the fundamental question as I get older and older is like, is there such a thing as an odor object? We've talked about citrus, we've talked about durian, we talked about bad things, cow dung or whatever, right? But is that purely odor-based object, or is it because we associate them then visually, right?
So do you, in your work, whenever we talk about testing for smell, if we don't have context to it and you just put in an odor in front of someone, it's often very difficult for that person to identify exactly what that odor is. But if they have a picture to choose from or words to choose from, it's much easier. So does that argue against having an odor object?
It's a question. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I've only started thinking about it seriously recently, to be honest. I don't know what, Bob, what do you think?
I think like when neuroscience started, we had this kind of idea about how the brain should work, which is you should have a bunch of detectors. They go and they send information to a special place in the brain that's only for vision or only for smell or only for hearing. And then kind of there's like some motion in the middle that kind of integrates information. And then that goes out to your muscles and you generate actions. And it kind of, all the information flows in this way. And it's clear that actually the brain's a jumble, right? That everyone's talking to everyone. And if you look in your visual centers, there's information about the things you're hearing and the things you're doing. And it's probably true that in olfactory centers, that's the case as well. That when you look at brain centers responsible for olfaction, they don't just encode information about what you're smelling. They probably also encode information about where you are, what you're doing, and maybe what you're seeing or hearing as well. I think that's all emerging science, but I think that's likely. And so it's possible that actually there's no such thing as a pure sensory object. There's no pure smell object, but really things are combinations of behaviors and sights and sounds and smells. And that's how we really interact with the world.
And I think verbal and suggestions are going back to this advertising thing, because I'm so sure that, if you talk to a kid from the city and he smells, cow dung, he goes, oh, reels. But if you're raised on a farm, it's normal. It's not a big deal. So I think, this whole idea they found out, as in the 60s, that women, despite all this thing about holding their laundry up to the light to see how clean it was, suddenly realized people didn't do that. They smelled it. Hence, the whole industry of Tide fresh scent came into being. And they were competing for the cleanest smell, which is all chemical. So I think we're being led by the nose, no pun intended, down this path, because I think a lot of things, if you put, some sort of urine in a bottle and it was clear and you passed it in front of somebody along with lots of other things, I bet they might not even know what it was. I mean, I'm not talking about something that's been standing around for 2 weeks, but fresh things, I think people wouldn't necessarily be so upset by them. And I think it's interesting that right now they've developed all these kind of transgender scents that are for men and women. And some of them are quite sort of bitter smelling. They've got oud in them, Middle Eastern kind of smells, which typically you wouldn't associate with a perfume, which shows you that something that you can find odorous can be actually quite attractive if it's packaged the right way. So I'm all about the packaging, that we've become, we're out of touch with our own noses. I think that's my thought. But speaking of that, because of COVID, you are all involved in research and you are seeing patients, Eric. Has this been a good period in terms of lots of funding coming forward from people, or has it accelerated a lot of bad science and quick fixes to this problem of losing your sense of smell? All of you can answer that. So, Eric, what do you think?
I'd like to say that it weighs more towards increased funding, but I haven't quite seen that yet. And actually, I've seen more of the opposite, where there's a lot of studies out there that it was just a boon of like papers, especially in the clinical field, where they're quasi kind of science and studies. But out of all that, if you just filter through it and really concentrate on certain articles and really kind of look at them carefully, there was good science coming from it. And the good thing is that they took advantage of a known virus, an identified virus that was causing smell loss. Prior to COVID-19 and the pandemic, there was post-viral smell loss. 30% of the patients, 40% of the patients that came to my clinic had a bad cold that caused their smell loss. But we didn't know what the virus was because it wasn't it wasn't a pandemic. It wasn't hitting everyone, and certain people probably had some type of immunity to it or something like that. And it didn't affect everybody the same way. So it was a great opportunity to actually identify a virus and see how it is, and we haven't figured this out yet, how it is causing the smell loss. It may be a totally different mechanism than the other viral smell losses in the past, but still fascinating kind of science. And have to thank Bob for some of the work that he did early on, identifying the receptors and where they were in the olfactory epithelium that kind of cleared the path for most people, although there's still errors in reporting on the fact that neurons have the receptor for the COVID virus, which isn't true, and still trying to teach people that. So
say that aloud. So it's the neurons around.
The cells around.
Cells around the neuron that are affected, not.
The virus attacks cells because some cells in the human body, but not all, have a receptor that allows the virus to infect the cell. And in your olfactory epithelium in your nose, it's specifically the support cells that have this receptor and can be infected. The neurons in your nose that transmit information from your nose to the brain don't have the receptor. And so although it's clear that your nose is being affected, that your neurons are being affected, it's probably not true that the virus directly attacks the neurons. It's probably true that whatever's going on is indirect. And I think, as Eric was saying, we still don't quite know what that is. And as Eric was saying, there's been a lot of confusing science, right, that has come out in the last year as people have tried to come up with theories, as fast as they can. And I think a little bit the smoke is settling now. And people are kind of taking a step back and trying to understand what the big principles are that are emerging. And I totally agree. I think we as humans haven't had a real appreciation for sense or smell. And in a weird paradoxical sense, this virus is a kind of important tool, both to focus our attention on the importance of smell as humans, but also to understand how smell works. And I think, maybe the research that will happen over the next few years will lead us to a better understanding of how we actually, engage with the olfactory world around us.
Yeah, I think one sort of semi-philosophical point is that often when you do basic research, you do want to justify saying how does it help humanity? What does it cure, or how does it make your life better? Which is, I think it's a fair point. I think it was a little harder in smell because people thought it was a luxury sense. And I think maybe the one sad but paradoxically helpful thing is that I think we have less of a job now convincing people that it is important because we have large groups of people who know it's important.
That's a great point. Well, I can't believe it, but an hour has gone by. It's been very, very stimulating. I want to thank Bob Datta, who's Professor of Neurobiology at Harvard Medical School, Venki Murty, who is Professor of Molecular and Cellular Biology at Harvard Center for Brain Science, and Eric Holbrook, who is Director of Rhinology over at Mass Eye and Ear. So fascinating, very, very more room for discussion there and interest on my part anyway. Cambridge Forum is founded through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and of course you. So if you'd like to donate or just sign up, please go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org. There you will find podcasts of this program and lots of others, as well as video links to programs and access to a large collection of digitally mastered classic recordings. What can I say but thank you all for your sense of sense and for all your knowledge and your good work.
Thanks for having us.
Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.